Imagine you're the Pope and you're writing an encyclical for the whole wide world. And obviously you're going to talk about things like sea level rise for island states. And you'll talk about, people living in mountains or people who are going through, massive droughts. But those examples I just gave do not apply to a Canadian context. And being a Canadian and speaking to Canadians, it's good to see what Laudato Si is telling us. Obviously, if you're from a Western country, you might relate with most of what I'm going to say. But right now, just to be honest, what is he saying to Canadians? First one, fossil fuels. We know that technology based on the use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay. Oh my goodness. To have such a strong church document saying something so clearly about getting rid of fossil fuels was quite amazing, and it had a huge ripple effect. And why is it so important in a Canadian context? Well, I'll just show you an example. The encyclical was published in June 2015. Only 2 months earlier, I had organized in Quebec City a Green Churches Forum with people from 8 different denominations. And so all these Christians we gathered, and we also signed a common declaration. And in there, which was written by one of my friends who's a pastor and an activist, he wrote this beautiful thing, and 7 out of the 8 denominations, they approved of the message as it was. But the Catholic representative said, I have a problem with this sentence. And it was a sentence that was taking a clear stance against a pipeline that was going to go through Canada and sell dilbit, diluted bitumen, that came from the tar sands, and just make it flow to the Maritimes and then sell it there. So that means thousands of kilometers of pipeline with a very thick product that would cause lots of environmental problems. Okay, so and just creating all of these greenhouse gases that we really don't need. So so it was clear in the Common Declaration. So the Catholic representative said, no, I won't add my name if that's in there. It's still too controversial. I don't want to sign. Find another way of saying it. And we found another way of saying it, which we just didn't use the word pipeline, and it wasn't as clear as it was. And finally he signed it. But it just shows how sensitive it was. So, and this happened 2 months before Laudato Si was published. And so this is why this passage right here is so awesome. It clearly states that we have to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Second Canadian concern, Canadian mines. Now, when we look at lots of mines in Africa and South America, very often the head office is in Canada. Why is that? Well, I mean, our laws about mining, are more than 150 years old. They were written in the 1850s, and with a very colonialist approach that, we just stick our flag and we own this, and we just take a bunch of resources and leave. And lots of the mining in Canada still today is done where there is absolutely no population around. And so, we can mine without, really having people who will seem concerned. So these mining companies have their head office in Canada, so they have to respect the laws from Canada even though they're mining somewhere else. And then in the country where they are, usually, laws are very weak or not enforced. So that has to change. And so now it leads me to this passage where the Pope says this: a true ecological debt exists, particularly between the global north and south, connected to commercial imbalances with effects on the environment, and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time. What does this mean? It means that mining companies, like the ones from Canada, they go to a region, let's say somewhere in Africa, start digging, release a bunch of pollutants which have health issues with the local population. So they get all the bad stuff, but then all the benefits go all to the company, and no benefits trickle down to the population that had all of those resources before. So all of these riches have been going to the north, and then it creates a debt. The global north owes something to the global south now. And Canadian mining companies have to play fair game and change their laws. Okay, so Canadian concern number 3, First Nations. I just loved that Pope Francis included this. Indigenous communities should be the principal dialogue partners, especially when large projects affecting their land are proposed. Now, what does the Pope mean by their land? I'll give you an example. When you look at a map in Canada, you might see lots of reserves, okay? Native reserves, where lots of Canadian laws don't apply there because they can finally at least self-manage that portion of the land. But they're so small compared to their traditional land. And when you talk to people from these different First Nations villages, well, if you take time to listen, you can hear stories and legends and myths that relate to the land. That hill over there has meaning. That river has meaning. And so when we come with these huge projects and start digging and mining in one of the hills and start diverting the flow of the water in a river, we're playing with their identity. It's part of their identity. So we should be with them as dialogue partners, not only for what affects them on their reserve, but what affects them on their traditional land. And finally, let's talk about growth. Now, for 20 years I was a pastoral associate. I worked in the church with, I have to admit, a very small salary. And I remember just looking at the rich and thinking, how come they're so obsessed with growth and Wall Street and the marketplace and just to think about their obsession with growth. And I thought, it doesn't affect me. I'm not obsessed with the growth like they are. But then, even though I had a small salary, I would put money in our RSP, so my pension fund, so that one day I would touch that money again, because it would have been fruitful, because there would have been growth in the meantime. So see, it even affected me. This obsession for growth. The Pope says, but we need to grow in the conviction that a decrease in the pace of production and consumption can at times give rise to another form of progress and development. So, rather than being obsessed with growth, sometimes we can just be satisfied with a smaller growth. when I look at my vegetables, I'm happy to have planted seeds and at the end to have a certain amount of growth, but I'm not, provoking it and expecting more. And I'm certainly not expecting infinite growth on a finite planet. So thank you, Pope Francis, for these concerns that do touch and affect Canadians directly.